Good evening all, and welcome. For the most part, hospitals are places we don't often want to be in, even more so now, thanks to COVID-19. So, I hope everyone's ready to get comfortable, get your medic's hat, and let the darkness take control. I work in a children's emergency room, and have seen and heard my fair share of things. I have multiple stories, but this one always sticks out to me, but not in a scary way. Several years ago, I was working third shift, and it had been an unfortunate evening. We had lost a child, a regular patient of the ED, earlier in my shift, and, well, that's something that stays with you. However, working in this environment, you have to go on with your day. You're allowed to mourn, but for 12 hours you are there to help every child that comes through those doors. Usually around 3 AM, the ED is able to start closing down hallways due to the lower volume of patients, and that night I decided to take a much needed break away from the noise in one of the hallways we had just closed. I was hiding away in the unit secretary area of the hallway when I heard a child's laugh and footsteps running down the hallway into a room. Again, this isn't a particularly unusual thing, because we have children everywhere in the hospital. However, I wanted to investigate, because there shouldn't be a child running around unattended in the closed area of the ED. I walk in the room where I heard the child, and it was completely empty, with the lights still being off. Behind me I heard the same thing, but in another room, but this time the lights were switched on. Again, I go investigate and it was empty. Confused, I turned off the lights and went back to the desk. I sit there for a few minutes and see the light switch back on in one of the rooms, and shortly after I hear the same laugh. I get up and start walking to the room, and as I get close I hear the same laugh and the light switches right back off when I get there. At this point I can hear my heart pounding through my chest. I knew something wasn't right. I walk into the room and turn on the light, and my heart drops. Sitting on the bed is the patient I had come to know very well throughout the years. It was the patient I watched pass away several hours ago in our trauma room. I immediately started tearing up, and I remember wanting to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He looked at me, smiled, and then laughed, and just like that, he was gone. I haven't seen him since that night. Maybe I was sleep deprived and seeing things. But in that moment I felt a sense of peace. I knew he was okay. It is definitely an experience that I will never forget, and honestly one that I never want to forget. I would like to share with you a story that happened to my mother at the end of last year. We're from Catalonia in Spain. My mum is a doctor who works on a public hospital as a radiologist. She has no mental illness and is overall healthy, and the building is in good condition with no gas leaks or the like. She had a friend who went to her workplace to have some mammographs done. Everything goes as usual, and when they're done, my mum goes to an adjacent computer room where the images have been sent. She closes the door after her, and no more than 30 seconds later she hears the doorknob turn violently, as if someone was trying to enter the room. At first she thought it was her friend, so she called, "Come in." Note that the doors have lead protection to avoid ionizing radiation piercing through. But the knob kept turning. They were shaking it as well, so she yelled, "Come on in," and thought how rude it was for them to act like this. It was then she realized her friend could not be there, as she was putting her clothes back on, and there was no way she'd be ready. She explicitly told me she had the feeling there would be no one behind that door once she opened it. So that was it. She quickly opened it to see no one there. There have been a few other incidences around that room too. For example, one night there were 2 doctors with my mum, when suddenly one of her co-workers witnessed a bottle of gel flying at extreme speed against a wall. There was nobody there beside the 3. They were all astonished. I know this sounds a bit cliché. Maybe I'm not too experienced. but I can assure you she didn't make it up. One of her co-workers says there really is something wrong with that floor. No one really knows what. When I was a senior at Purdue University, my great-uncle Hank was in a serious car accident and hospitalized. My dad and I were very close to Uncle Hank. He was my confirmation sponsor when I was a kid, and acted like another grandpa to me as a kid, and was by far my dad's favorite uncle. So we were very concerned to hear this news. When the doctor spoke to the family, he unfortunately did not have a good prognosis. He didn't expect Uncle Hank to live longer than a few weeks. After he was hospitalized, several of Uncle Hank's kids came back to Indianapolis in order to be with him before he passed. One night a week or so after the accident, my father received a phone call from someone at the hospital, informing my dad that Uncle Hank had passed. My dad thanked them and immediately called his cousins that he knew were at the hospital that night. Here was where the story gets strange. My dad's cousin answered the phone, obviously shaken and crying, but incredibly confused as to how my dad knew that Uncle Hank had passed. He told my dad that Uncle Hank passed less than a minute before my dad called, and that the doctors and nurses were still in the hospital room, turning off all the machines and speaking to the family. There was no one outside of the doctors and nurses and family in that room that knew of his passing, let alone someone who could call my dad so soon after it had happened. My dad's cousin checked with the nurses station, and no one there had called my dad, and they didn't have his phone number on file. We really have no explanation as to who or what called my dad that night to inform him of Uncle Hank's passing. But my dad and I too believed that this might have been Uncle Hank's way of letting us know that he's moved on. My mum was in training to become a nurse while she was pregnant with me, and one of the places she worked on was an old psychiatric hospital, since abandoned. One night while pregnant, she was on the late shift, with an early shift the following morning, and it was snowing. So my dad insisted she stayed in the nurses' quarters, which is a separate building from the hospital, rather than risk the drive home. Not happy with the idea, but understanding the reasons, she stayed and didn't sleep the entire night. A nurse had previously ended her life in the nurses' quarters, and there was nobody else staying there, so she was ever so slightly terrified. She said she heard whispers, saw shadows, and was generally a wreck by the time she had to go back to work in the morning. Side note, I like to joke that the ghosts there are the reason I have so many spooky experiences, and why when I go home the activity there is amplified, saying that they attach themselves to me and follow her home, and stayed with me after birth. This usually ends up with my mum being freaked out. Also, a friend from home was experienced working in the local hospital administration block. Their office had a connecting wall with the morgue, and on multiple occasions while the morgue was known to be empty, sounds were heard through the walls, like things moving, people walking, and something scratching on the walls. In my hometown in South Texas, there's a hospital that is abandoned. It has an extremely demonic presence. I have two friends who have gone inside and ventured down to the basement level. There, they have heard growling and seen glowing red eyes. That was 8 or 9 years ago. My little brother, who is 17, has had friends go into the basement there and encountered the same thing, including the stairs that leave the basement to be in a completely different spot than when they entered. At night, if you get close, it feels like your heart is being clenched tightly. It's hard to catch your breath, as if something is sucking the air out of your lungs. The feeling of despair and panic just engulfs you. You just feel the need to get away from there as soon as possible, and that's just coming into the parking lot around 8 p.m. I haven't ventured inside, but the feeling I described are what I have felt along with my wife. The presence is intense and extremely powerful. My wife also claims to have seen some stuff. The hospital I used to work at was extremely haunted. The 6th floor had been disused for a long time. It was the top floor, and no one ever went up there. There were times when I'd be using the elevator when I'd look on the little panel above the doors to see where it was at. And there would be times it would be on the 6th floor. As far as I was aware, only the janitors had the keys to that floor, as well as the night security staff. There would be absolutely no reason anyone should ever be up there. But more often than not, when I saw it, I'd feel a chill run up my spine. I can't remember what it was used for, as I haven't worked there for some years. Anyway, at one point in time, I was working the night shift. It was extremely late, around 4 a.m., and I was fairly tired already. It was a very slow night, and I had spent some time chatting with some of the other nurses. I get paged to go to a different floor, so I make my leave and head to the elevator. As the doors chime, I step in and look around me. There's no one in the elevator, so I jump on and descend 2 floors. But instead of opening on the 5th floor where I needed to get off, it kept on going. Now, in order to reach the 6th floor, you have to have a special key on the elevator itself in order for it to even take you up there. So at this point I was getting freaked out. It reached the 6th floor and the doors dinged. They opened, and I looked around. I was on the fabled 6th floor. I knew I'd only be a few minutes late, but I couldn't risk having a look around. I was so fascinated with why this top floor had been abandoned. I looked around. There were some papers still at the nurse's station. Doors were open. A thin layer of dust actually covered a lot of it. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I wondered if any security members ever actually came up here, or if they had any reason to. I started walking around when I heard what sounded like a chair, one of those chairs on wheels, move ever so slightly, like it was pushed. I turned to look in the direction of the sound to see said chair move from just behind a desk. I gave a shudder, and at that point I'd had enough spooks, and I turned around and pressed the button at the elevator. The elevator was on floor 1 apparently, so I had to wait a little while. I turned around, pushing the button frantically, but there was nothing going on. I looked and saw the numbers start to ascend, 2, 3, and that's when it happened. I heard the chair. It sounded like it was pushed with a lot of force. I looked behind me, and sure enough, the chair is rolling towards me at high speed. I tried to move out of the way, and it slammed into the doors with a loud thud. I looked and shouted, demanding to know who it was. At this point, I was convinced a member of the security team must have come up, not locked the elevator, summoned it up, and then were trying to prank me. I knew the guy who was on shift, Bradley, so I shouted out to him, "Hey Bradley, if you're messing around with me, you know I'm going to tell the supervisor." So I started walking up, no longer feeling scared but brave, convinced Bradley was there joking around with me. There weren't many places to hide. Most of the doors were propped open with door stoppers. I looked around. It was pretty freaky, but I simply couldn't see him. Where could he have concealed himself? I knew it must have been him. So I started making my way back to the elevator. It was stuck on the 4th floor. Who knows what was going on? I waited and waited, and it still didn't come. And then I thought I'd call Bradley on his phone. I'd hear the ringer, or at least the vibration, find out where he is, and beat him at his own game. So I pulled out my phone and started to ring him. It rung, but even though I heard quite attentively, I still couldn't hear him. After about 30 seconds of ringing, which is a substantial amount of time, the door chimed and I went into the elevator. I pressed the 5th floor and started going down. I made it down to my floor and Bradley didn't pick up, so I thought nothing of it and knew that I'd beaten him at his own game. Maybe he thought the same thing I did and put it on silent. I got to work and at about 6 a.m. I get a phone call from Bradley. I ask him if he's finally man enough to admit that I caught on to his little game, feeling so smug with myself. However, his words sent a chill down my spine. "Bro, I only just woke up. What are you talking about? No one goes up to the 6th floor. I don't even think I've been there myself other than in the training day." At that point, a chill certainly went right through my body. Was he telling the truth? I asked my supervisor who was on night shift today, and she tells me it's some other guy, Edgar. I go up and call him and ask him why the elevator took me to the top floor. What was going on? He says he didn't have an explanation for it, but that if we wanted we can check the security footage and try and find what the hell was going on. So we do. When we look at it, the chair was pushed by an invisible force and hit the elevator door. That was all visible. But he was always downstairs in his little cubicle. He never once came up or unlocked the lift. One of the freakiest things that happened to me. I spoke with a number of co-workers about it. Some of them believed me, some of them didn't. And a few of them even said they had their own experiences. Janet's was by far the creepiest. She explained in her story that this had happened to her once. She was heading up, and that the elevator stopped on the top floor. In curiosity, she took a peep around, but as she was waiting for the doors to go down again, did she hear some footsteps coming from behind her. She turned around, expecting to see the person who'd gone up there before that had unlocked the door, trying to apologize, she said, because she knew she wasn't supposed to be up there. But there was no one there. She was looking directly at nothing, but the footsteps were still approaching. She was getting extremely scared. As the footsteps drew ever closer, she started to shudder. She turned around and started hammering at the button of the elevator, but it wasn't coming up any faster. And when they finally were right behind her, they evaporated into nothing. She says that was one of the scariest moments of her life. My other colleague told me a similar story, but this one was by far the creepiest. Again, elevator. Goes in. Punches for the 3rd floor. It doesn't stop at the 3rd floor, so she punches for the 5th to try and get off, but it doesn't work. The top floor was her final destination. The doors open and she looks around. The lights are off. The place has been disused and abandoned for a long time. She gets off the elevator because she wants to have a peep around, just to see what's on this floor. She was a little nervous and worried that she wouldn't be able to get back down, but she knew deep down that if she really wanted to call someone, she could get maintenance to come and get her down. No worries. She started looking around the floor, interested in seeing what had happened here. As she made her way through, she started to feel an unearthly chill overtake her. She then very clearly heard a child's laugh at the very end of the long hallway. She squinted, wondering if it was perhaps a child playing in the hospital with the elevator and somehow managed to get up here. She started running, telling them to stop and that they needed to come back down. She swears she saw a blur run from one room to another. At this point she was angry. They had just directly disobeyed her, and they were in a hospital, for God's sake, on a floor they shouldn't be on. She was very concerned, and upon getting to the room she looked around. There was a desk, a cupboard, and not much else. She looked under the desk, and in the cupboard there was nothing there. It was completely empty. No person, no anything. She told herself she must have just been seeing and hearing things. It was quite dark and creepy after all. But you see, there's street lighting all around the hospital, which gave a nice orange glow on the inside, so it was still fairly well lit, by all accounts. She started to make her way back to the elevator, frightened, but trying to tell herself she didn't actually see anything. Upon pressing the button, did she hear a faint whisper in her ear. "I'm right here." She turned around and screamed, but there was no one there. She just about wet herself. She kept hammering on the door and pressing the button, but the elevator wasn't coming up any faster. She was sweating, in hysterics, and just waiting for the moment that the doors would open and free her from this torment. Just being up there was making her nervous. When the doors finally opened, she jumped in, and just as they were closing, she looked out, and for a split second, she thought she saw another shadow dart from one room to another. That was enough for her. She didn't actually tell anyone the story. The supervisor asked why she was late, and she said that she was just in the restroom and apologized, even though she looked very shaken up. It's only when I shared my experience that people started to share their own. They say that sometimes the elevator will take people up to the top floor, but most of the time people dare not leave its doors and go down the elevator again to not bother whatever spooks reside up there. I wonder if the reason they disused that part of the hospital is because of the creepy apparition. I guess I'll never know. My visit to Yorktown Memorial Hospital. We had heard this place was haunted, and that you can get creepy things happen to you if you are being a dick to the paranormal. I've always been able to feel things, and I have that eerie sixth sense some people joke about having. The day we went was Halloween 2018. It was about a 2-hour drive away, and supposed to be fun. I went with one of my best friends at the time, and my husband, both of which are huge skeptics. Right off the bat, when we get into the parking lot, the alarms in my head are screaming at me to not go in there. There's something in there that's bad, and of course, like the idiot I am, I go in. We get inside and are surrounded by candles on the desk, and are greeted by the caretakers and tour guides. We are told we can only use our phone lights and take photos, and begin our tour. The hospital had so many open doorways, but they had these cage walls to keep people from climbing over and taking things from inside. There was so much graffiti on the walls and holes in the ceiling and cracks. We come up to a room full of old dolls and a rocking chair, and I feel a creep on my forearm. The caretaker and guide tell us about a small child who will play with guests if they take her ball and roll it down the hallway, and if you take a doll from her room, she is not thrilled with you and might even scratch you. Of course, we couldn't expect a normal night on Halloween in a haunted location, because once we started moving on, the tour began to storm. We started following the guide to the next hallway, and they continued telling us about all the amazing artifacts in the hospital still intact, like the metal bed that was just a slab that so many have passed away on. Once we enter the kitchen, I immediately feel a difference in energy, like something was following us. The guide then asked us if anyone gets the burning sensation to speak up, because the end of the night when they did a lockdown investigation, one of the girls in the team with tattoos got burn marks out of nowhere. I didn't think much of it until we started walking down the hall where another patient, JT, passed waiting for someone to help him, because his friends had abandoned him on the doorway. I could feel cold on my hands and arms. When we went upstairs, we went to see the chapel, and I felt so lightheaded standing and staring into the broken room. Down the hallway from the chapel, I could smell sulfur and rotting eggs. The smell was so bad I had to cover my nose. When we walked further down the hallway, we passed a room, and a huge waft of soap hit my nose, and I felt a hard tug on my backpack. On this section of the tour, no one was behind me, and my group had gone ahead. as if it felt like I was being held back. I walked towards the front of the hallway and get an urge to look down the hallway, the one that no one was supposed to be in. That's when I saw a tall, dark, skinny figure, like a man with one hand bent out like he was waving, and a bright white light in the other, like a phone but brighter. I started calling my husband's name because I thought it was him. He had a tendency to wander off, and he came out of the stairwell that everyone else was on, and I couldn't believe it. I saw an actual dark figure with yellow eyes. One of the guys came up to me and asked if I was alright because I couldn't believe it. Was this the smell, and was this the tug? Or am I just crazy? When we finally got downstairs, I told my husband and the best friend in the car that I saw something, and both said that they felt cold gusts of wind and thought it was the storm. After that tour, I had night terrors for almost a month. I would wake up crying and shaking because I could see the figure in my room, but whenever I'd be able to actually get up, it was gone. I work in a residential treatment center for teens and kids. I experienced some weird things when I worked overnight there. I now work days, and there was one room in particular that the kids always dislike. So when I worked overnight, one girl moved into the room for another room, and always states she couldn't sleep in her new room because she felt like she was being watched. Months after she discharged, we had another girl move into the room. This room is different than the others, and the bathroom sinks in the room and makes a visual barrier between the main section and the sink area. She had moved a comfy chair over by the sink instead of by her window. When I asked her why she wanted it way over there, she said she feels like someone sits there and watches her at night. Now, just recently I had a third resident who was not here when these two girls were here, and say that she doesn't like her room. We have 6 rooms on the unit, and this one is the 4th room she's been in. The other night I took her to the kitchen for some positivity time, and she admitted she didn't want to go to bed. I inquired as to why, and she says she has a hard time sleeping in there because she feels watched. She says she's been closing her shades at night, but it hasn't helped. She's never felt this way in any of the other rooms. The room is also next to our family room, where at night, a clock flew off the wall and landed several feet away. I worked in a rural district general hospital, and I had a few incidents. The first one when I was working night shift. Due to the hospital being so small, you were the only on-site doctor covering the medical and surgical ward. You also have to clerk any administration from the emergency department. The hospital was built into a hill, therefore there was a corridor running from the ED to the other end of the hospital. But where the ED was on the ground floor, to get to the wards, you would be in the basement at the far end of the hospital. I used to use this corridor all the time in the day as it ran under outpatients, and so you didn't have to navigate around people. Anyway, this one night shift, I was bleeped into the ward, so I was walking along this corridor. Halfway along it, I felt really uncomfortable. Something was staring into the back of my neck. I just felt overwhelmingly unsafe. I sprinted to the end of the corridor and ran up the stairs as I didn't want to wait down there for the lift. Subsequently, I found out that the corridor used to have the morgue on it, but was moved some years prior. I've never used that corridor again. My second story. Working nights in the ED. A man had been in the clinical depressions unit, aka a kind of halfway house between the ED and wards. He was really unwell and was basically for end-of-life care, and he arrested and died at 11 p.m. At 4 a.m. I sat with the nurses at the nurses' station looking at the door to the room he'd been in. Huh? Sun must be coming up, I think to myself, seeing the light in the room slowly increasing. A few minutes later, the door to the room clicks open by itself. Once fully opened, I realized it wasn't the sun coming, but the emergency light that comes on in a power outage. However, the power was on everywhere else, and none of the other rooms have emergency lights on. A few minutes later, the electronic doors which control access to the department stop working altogether. One of the nurses laughs. "We forgot to open the window to let his spirit out," so she pops in to open the window. 5 minutes later, an alarm goes off at the far end of the department. It's the pressure alarm for the isolation room, basically a negative pressure room used for infectious patients to stop whatever pathogen is there being spread through the department. It has a sort of airlock, which if neither of the set of doors are open for a certain period will trigger an alarm. Nobody had been down there all evening. The room was empty apart from the deceased's patient mobility scooter which was being stored there. He obviously wanted to use it to get himself home. These two experiences happened several years ago, before my grandpa, a retired doctor, retired. The first experience happened to him while he was trying to get some sleep in his room. He says that right before he could fall asleep, he felt as if someone was pulling the covers at either side of him with great strength, keeping him in place. Immediately he started wrestling to get free, and he did so for around a minute, before the force disappeared. He then proceeded to turn on the lights and look around, but there was obviously no one else in the room, as only he had the keys. The second experience happened when he was in the dining room chatting with the nurses. Take into account this was a small, 2-story hospital, and that night there were no patients, when suddenly the power went out, and for some weird reason the emergency generator didn't go off. While everyone was still processing what was going on, the doors to the second floor started slamming closed, and multiple loud steps could be heard. Before my grandpa could calm down the nurses and reassure them, they stormed out the building, so he went after them. After a few minutes the power came back and everyone went back in, although hesitantly. My grandpa is very skeptic and doesn't believe in ghosts or any of that, but when I asked him what he thinks caused those incidents, he says he honestly doesn't know. This was roughly 7 years ago, and I worked night shift on a psychiatric ward in the north of Sweden. I didn't believe in ghosts, but some strange shenanigans were quite often heard in the floor above my ward, at the doctor's office. It sounded like someone was moving furniture a few minutes every now and then. We had a nickname for the sounds, simply the ghost. One very calm night on the ward, the sound went on for much longer than expected, so me and my 2 colleagues decided to search for the source of the sound. When we went upstairs, we could easily pinpoint the dragging and slamming noises to one particular office of a certain psychiatrist. As soon as we opened the door, it went completely quiet. We stood there for a time baffled, and one of my colleagues let out a "hello?" and as a response, 2 of his desk drawers opened fast and violently. We ran away. The sound was almost on a nightly basis. I might add it isn't the only strange experience I've had, but it was definitely the most frightening and hardest to rationalize of them all. There's a well-known folklore in my town about the man in blue. In our town there is a very small hospital that attends minor ailments and sometimes care for the elderly. My mother worked there for many years. There's this folklore about the man in blue, you see. Lots of people have seen him, and even the local paper has reported on him several times during its run. It's not just known to the staff, it's known to the entire town. Sometimes on Halloween, people will gather around to see if they can get a glimpse of the man in blue from the window. Obviously they're not allowed inside, but in the spirit of things, the hospital will give out candy or leave out bowls to those dressed spookily. In any case, my mum worked there for many a year and only had one thing happen to her that convinced her the apparition was very real indeed. She was attending a family friend of my grandfather's, a friend that he had grown up with in the village for a long time. He was reaching the end of his life, and my mum had to administer some kind of injection and just check up on him. Usual routine stuff. She was sitting and chatting with him when she realized she needed something from the other room. So she nipped out to get it quickly while he waited. Just as she was coming back, did she see a man in blue enter the room. She wondered who it was, and as she entered the room, she asked where the man in blue went. He confirmed that he'd never seen anyone, and she'd only been gone about 2 minutes. She shook her head. She must be tired. And so she applied the injection, and that was that. But that very same night, he passed away from a stroke. It was very unexpected, because that wasn't what was ailing him. But in any case, it was sad for the whole town. He was a very well-known and beloved character. My mum spoke about the event a few weeks later with some co-workers, saying that she'd seen a man in blue enter and how he passed away that same day. They told her it was definitely the antics of the man in blue, the well-known ghost. But there was one thing that the nurses didn't like to talk about the man in blue and his characteristics. It is often said that when he shows up, it's an omen of death, and the person he comes to visit is often the one who passes. Some people say he was a doctor who used to work here long ago, and he comes back to check out patients who are on their way out. I used to work nights at hospital as a security guard. The work can be pretty dull, as for the most part people are quite decent and behaving, so there's not an awful lot to do. Maybe make sure no one steals from the vending machines, I suppose. Anyway, this happened one odd evening. I was just at my little booth trying to read a book when all of a sudden there's a commotion outside the front door. I jump out and go to see what's going on. There's a man. All he's dressed in are socks and a really long coat. He starts freaking about and flailing on the floor. I called into the hospital for help to see if there was anything they could do. I had no idea what was going on. And a few nurses rush out and see if he's all right. The man was flopping like a fish. The eyes went to the back of his skull, and he was very much having a fit of some kind. The doctors and nurses try to restrain him, get a gurney in, and take him inside to keep watch on him and see what's going on and try and talk to him, as he was just muttering and gibbering. Obviously, I didn't hear straight away what was going on. I work security and am not a medical professional. But one of my friends who was a nurse in there comes out, and she tells me all that's gone on with that guy, as I was legitimately quite concerned for him. She told me that he would be all right, but that he had taken something very dangerous and that his life was in mortal peril. He was lucky that he made it to the hospital in time. Things could have been really bad. That's not the end though. They saved the guy, but a few nights later, he came back, clawing his way to the hospital door, still having a fit. It was the most bizarre thing. I couldn't believe he had returned. So I call back to someone else, and they come and try and escort him in. They get him on a gurney and he's flailing, and they're trying to talk to him and get control. But on that night, he took too much of whatever he took, and he passed away in the hospital. It was a dark day for me. It's pretty numbing to see someone in okay health, and then to be gone in a flash. A few months after this happened, I had all but forgotten about the strange man. When I saw him again, he just walked past the hospital door and vanished. The thing is, I was zoned out, just staring out the window. My book had gotten a bit boring, so I was just thinking about nothing. And obviously seeing this figure catches my attention. I look at him intensely, wondering how in the world he's there. It took my brain a few seconds to realize he was dead. And when I look, he passes my little window and vanishes. I step out the booth, look out, and there's no way he could have made it more than a few paces without me seeing. But he's simply gone, There's nowhere he could have gone. The hospital is colossal. There is literally no place he could have gone that I wouldn't have seen him at. This really confused me. At first, I thought that my nurse friends were playing a trick on me, and the patient hadn't actually passed away, as of course I'd never seen the body. Not that I needed to, their word was enough. But when I spoke to them about it, she gave me a confused look. "Oh, you've seen him too?" she said. "He likes to wander around the ground floor. I didn't know he also went outside. Turns out, after he passed, he's been spotted in several places around the hospital, just walking and then vanishing. Certainly unsettling for all us security and nurses. Anyway, that's my story." Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's hospital stories. We had a nice little diverse range in my opinion. Some quite good stories, some short stories, but an interesting mix nonetheless. I hope you liked them. If you did, be sure to let me know. I'd like to remind all my patrons that we do have some exclusive content that a lot of you seem to not be listening to, so please listen to it and comment and stuff. Out of like the 100 patrons I've got, I get what, 1 or 2 or 3 comments, so I'm wondering if you guys are being notified at all. It is a little bit alarming, but yeah, I'd really appreciate it if you guys could let me know. Alright then, I think I'm going to end it here. My voice has been a bit off today in my opinion, and I've made a load of mistakes, so I'm going to go back and chop them all up. Alright then, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.